For most of the Cold War, Americans were taught to fear what they could see. We were trained to look at the hardware, the parades in Red Square, the ICBMs, the sheer volume of steel on the ground. Strength was measured in steel and firepower. But the real turning point of the Cold War did not arrive with an explosion or a speech. It arrived quietly, on paper, in rooms without windows, when the numbers finally refused to cooperate with ideology. By the late 1960s, deep inside US intelligence agencies, a question began to take shape, one that cut far deeper than military balance. It wasn't whether the Soviet Union could build weapons, it was whether its economic system could actually sustain a modern society over time. For years, Soviet leaders had promised that communism would not only match capitalism, but surpass it. They believed the game was rigged in their favor, that they couldn't lose. But if you looked past the parades, the cracks were starting to show. American analysts started doing the one thing the Soviets couldn't. They looked at the cold, hard numbers. They started digging into everything, from how much wheat was actually leaving the fields to how many lights were on in the factories at night. At first, the picture was blurred. Soviet statistics were incomplete, distorted, sometimes intentionally misleading. But once they lined up the data, the truth was undeniable. The growth that once looked unstoppable was hitting a wall. Factories rusted while managers cooked the books, and new ideas died before they ever left the drawing board. And most telling of all, the everyday experience of Soviet citizens was falling further behind that of Americans. Propaganda doesn't matter when the math simply doesn't add up. This wasn't a victory lap, it was a wake-up call. Inside classified CIA reports, a quiet conclusion formed. The Soviet economy was not catching up. It wasn't even close. The system wasn't accelerating, it was straining. And if the numbers were correct, then the Cold War was no longer a race between two futures. It became a contest of resilience. Who could take a punch, learn from it, and keep moving? You wouldn't have seen this in the headlines. Nobody popped champagne. But in those back rooms, the mood shifted completely. The United States no longer needed to prove that its system worked. The data was already doing that on its behalf, and once the numbers didn't lie, the outcome of the Cold War began to shift. It wasn't loud, but the trajectory was set. For much of the Cold War, the idea that the Soviet Union was economically catching up to the United States was not fringe thinking, it was mainstream. Politicians, journalists, and even some economists in the West accepted the notion that two systems were racing side by side, each powered by a different ideology but heading toward the same modern future. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 only reinforced that fear. If the Soviets could beat America into space, many assumed they could surpass it on the ground as well. Soviet propaganda worked relentlessly to cultivate this perception. Moscow pumped out stats showing record industrial output and massive new infrastructure. They wanted the world to see a juggernaut. Steel production, coal extraction, and military manufacturing were presented as proof that socialism was not only viable, but superior. They kept hammering the same message. Capitalism was a chaotic mess, and their central planning was a precision instrument. But nobody asked the uncomfortable question, where were these numbers actually coming from? In the United States, growth was measured not just by volume, but by value. Productivity, efficiency, and consumer welfare mattered. In the Soviet system, success was defined by meeting quotas, regardless of usefulness or quality. A factory that produced unusable machinery still counted as a success if the numbers looked right. This created an illusion of parity that appeared convincing on paper but collapsed under closer examination. CIA analysts began revisiting earlier assumptions. When Soviet growth rates were recalculated using comparable standards, the gap widened dramatically. Heavy industry had expanded, yes, but often at enormous cost and diminishing returns. Entire sectors existed to serve the plan, not the population. And while Soviet leaders spoke confidently about overtaking the West, internal data suggested they were struggling to maintain momentum. Before we go deeper into how they hid these numbers, I want to hear from you. In a global conflict, what do you think is more decisive, sheer military firepower or the underlying economic system? Does the tank matter if the factory that built it is obsolete? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. It's a debate that's still very much alive today. The myth of parity persisted because it was convenient for both sides. It fueled Soviet legitimacy and justified American vigilance. But by the late 1960s, intelligence assessments increasingly treated the idea with skepticism. The race was not neck and neck. One system was innovating faster, correcting mistakes, and raising living standards. The other was exhausting itself to appear strong. This realization marked a critical psychological shift. The Cold War was no longer viewed as a sprint between equals. It began to look more like a marathon, one where appearances could deceive in the short term, but fundamentals would decide the finish. And as analysts would soon discover, those fundamentals favored adaptability over control. If understanding an open economy is difficult, measuring a closed one is something else entirely. The Soviet Union did not merely lack transparency, it actively resisted it. Economic data was treated as a political weapon, released selectively and shaped to reinforce ideological confidence rather than reflect reality. This was a nightmare for the CIA. How do you grade a test when the student hides the paper? Early CIA efforts relied on indirect observation. Satellite imagery revealed the size and number of factories, rail lines, ports, and power plants. Energy consumption became a crucial proxy. Electricity usage, oil output, and transportation activity often revealed more than official statistics ever could. Analysts tracked freight movement, crop patterns, and even nighttime illumination to estimate real economic activity. Each data point alone was incomplete. Together, they began to tell a story. It wasn't a total collapse, at least not yet. It was something weirder, a distortion of reality. The Soviet economy could mobilize resources impressively for specific goals, arms production, space programs, heavy industry, but struggled to sustain balanced growth. Central planners prioritized scale over efficiency, output over outcome. Factories ran continuously, but often produced goods that were outdated, poorly designed, or unwanted. Warehouses filled up with junk nobody actually wanted. So, while they were technically hitting their targets on paper, the actual economic value was evaporating. CIA economists also refined comparative models to account for purchasing power, productivity, and opportunity cost. When adjusted for quality and usability, Soviet output figures shrank. A tractor counted as a tractor in official reports, regardless of whether it functioned properly or broke down within months. American equivalents, fewer in number, often delivered far greater long-term value. Agricultural monitoring provided especially revealing insights. Satellite analysis of planting and harvest cycles, combined with shipping data, allowed analysts to estimate yields with surprising accuracy. These estimates increasingly contradicted Soviet claims. Bad harvests were masked, shortfalls minimized, and failures blamed on weather rather than structure. Yet imports told the truth. Grain shipments from capitalist countries rose, quietly confirming what propaganda denied. The biggest change came when analysts realized their old methods were wrong. They had to get humble and look at the data differently. Analysts learned to distrust single indicators and instead focus on trends over time. When those trends were aligned across energy, agriculture, productivity, and consumption, the conclusion became harder to avoid. The Soviet economy was not simply underperforming temporarily, it was constrained by design. What made this realization so powerful was that it did not rely on speculation or ideology. It was built slowly, patiently, from data the system could not fully hide. The very effort to control information created patterns that, when observed from the outside, revealed the truth. And once those methods matured, the fog that once surrounded the Soviet economy began to lift, revealing a system far less competitive than it claimed and far more fragile than it appeared. As CIA analysts refined their measurements, one metric began to stand out above all others: productivity. Not how much was produced, but how efficiently labor, capital, and resources were transformed into real value. In this comparison, the gap between the two systems became increasingly difficult to ignore. In America, the market was brutal. If you made a crappy product, you went bust. That fear kept businesses sharp. Businesses that failed adapted or disappeared. Workers were rewarded for efficiency, innovation, and skill. New technologies moved quickly from research labs into everyday use. In the US, if you screwed up, you went broke. It was brutal, but it forced the system to get smarter. In the American market, failure meant you went broke, and that threat of bankruptcy forced companies to actually fix their problems. The Soviet economy operated by entirely different rules. Managers were evaluated on whether they met production quotas, not whether their output was useful or efficient. A factory that exceeded its steel target using outdated methods was praised, even if the steel was warped or unsuitable for modern applications. Innovation was risky. A failed experiment could end a career. As a result, doing things the same way, even poorly, was safer than trying something new. CIA productivity models captured this divergence clearly. American workers consistently produced more output per hour even in comparable industries. Automation, better tools, and decentralized decision-making compounded over time. In the Soviet system, labor intensity increased, but returns diminished. More effort yielded less progress. This created a domino effect that the planners couldn't stop. Poor productivity meant higher costs, greater resource consumption, and slower improvement in living standards. It also strained planning itself. As inefficiencies multiplied, central planners were forced to issue more directives to correct problems they could not fully see. Each correction added complexity, making the system harder to manage. One particularly revealing contrast involved manufacturing quality. American goods evolved rapidly, driven by consumer feedback and competition. Soviet goods changed slowly, if at all. Design flaws persisted for years. Replacement parts were scarce. CIA reports noted that even when production volumes were comparable, usability was not. Over time, productivity gaps translated into strategic consequences. A system that required more resources to achieve the same results had less flexibility in crises. It could not respond quickly to shocks or shifts in demand. Growth became harder to sustain. The margin for error shrank. What analysts understood was that productivity was not just an economic metric, it was a signal of systemic health. And by that measure, the Soviet economy was not improving, it was aging. The numbers did not suggest imminent collapse, but they pointed to something equally decisive, a future in which catching up became mathematically improbable. No amount of planning could substitute for a system that learned slowly and punished change. And once productivity told that story clearly, the idea of long-term economic parity quietly faded from serious consideration. But if you really wanted to see the rot in the system, you just had to look at the farms. On paper, the Soviet Union possessed everything it needed to feed itself: vast tracts of arable land, a large rural workforce, and decades of centralized planning devoted to maximizing output. Yet year after year, harvests failed to meet expectations. And when they did, the response revealed a truth the system could no longer conceal. CIA analysts watched Soviet agriculture closely because it was both essential and measurable. Weather patterns, planting cycles, and yields could be tracked with increasing precision through satellite imagery and trade data. When official reports claimed success, analysts compared them against grain shipments, storage capacity, and transportation flows. Again and again, the same pattern emerged: optimistic announcements followed by quiet imports. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet Union had become a major purchaser of grain from capitalist countries, most notably the United States and Canada. These purchases were not symbolic. They were large, recurring, and necessary to prevent shortages. Internally, this created an ideological problem. A system that claimed economic superiority was depending on its rival to feed its population. The causes were structural. Collective farms lacked incentives to increase efficiency or quality. Equipment was often outdated or poorly maintained. Distribution networks were rigid and wasteful, allowing crops to spoil before reaching consumers. Central planners could mandate targets, but they could not create motivation or adaptability. CIA assessments emphasized that this dependency was not temporary. Bad weather explained individual failures, but not decades of underperformance. Even in favorable years, yields lagged behind those of market-based systems. The gap persisted because the underlying mechanisms never changed. For American analysts, agricultural imports became a powerful indicator, not just of weakness, but of limits. Food is non-negotiable. A state can tolerate inefficiency in many areas, but not indefinitely where basic needs are concerned. Each grain deal quietly acknowledged that ideology could not override biology or logistics. What made this realization especially uncomfortable for Soviet leadership was visibility. Grain imports could not be hidden. Ships arrived, contracts were signed, and the population, increasingly aware of Western abundance, drew its own conclusions. In intelligence circles, agriculture reinforced a growing consensus. The Soviet economy could mobilize resources, but it could not optimize them. It could command effort, but not outcomes. And when a system fails at something as fundamental as feeding itself efficiently, no amount of rhetoric can fully restore confidence. The numbers once again spoke clearly, especially when the bread on the table depended on them. By the 1970s, one contrast had become impossible to dismiss, even for those determined to defend the Soviet system: the everyday lives of ordinary people. While military strength and industrial output could be debated in reports and speeches, consumer experience was visible, personal, and deeply felt. And in that arena, the gap between the United States and the Soviet Union was widening year by year. CIA analysts understood that consumer goods were not a superficial metric. They reflected the efficiency of production, the responsiveness of distribution, and the priorities of a system. In the United States, rising productivity translated into tangible improvements. Cars became more reliable, appliances more affordable, homes larger, and choices more abundant. Innovation flowed outward, touching daily life in ways that reinforced confidence in the future. In the Soviet Union, progress was uneven and limited. Sure, they had TVs and fridges on paper, but good luck actually getting one. You were looking at waiting lists that dragged on for years, and if you finally got a washing machine, it probably leaked. Repairs were frequent, parts scarce. A consumer might acquire a product only to discover that keeping it functional required constant improvisation. CIA reports noted that scarcity itself shaped behavior. Citizens learned to hoard, barter, and rely on informal networks to obtain basic goods. Time, an invisible cost, was consumed by queues and searches rather than leisure or productivity. These inefficiencies never appeared in official statistics, yet they defined daily life. What made the consumer gap so damaging was comparison. Through cultural exchanges, foreign broadcasts, and even word of mouth, Soviet citizens became increasingly aware of Western living standards. The The contrast undermined the narrative that hardship was temporary or necessary. If capitalism was collapsing, as propaganda claimed, why did it produce abundance instead? American analysts recognized that this disparity had psychological weight. Systems are judged not only by promises, but by lived experience. When expectations diverge from reality, legitimacy erodes. The Soviet state could explain military sacrifice. It struggled to explain empty shelves. Importantly, this gap was not the result of a single policy failure. It reflected the cumulative effect of low productivity, rigid planning, and weak incentives. Even when resources were available, the system lacked the flexibility to allocate them where demand existed. By the late 1970s, CIA assessments treated the consumer gap as structural and enduring. It was not a phase, it was a consequence. And no revision of statistics could hide it from those standing in line. To understand just how deep this gap was, you only have to look at a single afternoon in September 1989. Boris Yeltsin, a rising political star and future president of Russia, was visiting a suburban grocery store in Houston, Texas. It wasn't a staged visit. Yeltsin walked through the aisles of a Randall supermarket, staring in disbelief at the shelves. He saw dozens of different kinds of cheese, fresh produce in the middle of winter, and aisles of frozen Jell-O. He asked the manager if he needed a special education to run such a place. Later, in his autobiography, he would write that when he saw those shelves, he felt sick with despair for the Soviet people. He told his entourage that if the Soviet citizens saw the conditions in American supermarkets, there would be a revolution. In that moment, the thousands of CIA reports and the mountains of economic data were condensed into a single crushing realization. The race wasn't even close. While the Pentagon panicked about missiles, the real war was being lost in the breadline. You can't be a superpower if you can't feed your people. One of the most persistent myths of the Cold War was that the Soviet Union lacked scientific talent. In reality, Soviet researchers were often brilliant, well-trained, and capable of remarkable breakthroughs. From mathematics to aerospace engineering, the USSR produced world-class science. Yet CIA analysts identified a critical weakness that no amount of talent could overcome. Innovation rarely translated into widespread practical use. In the United States, technology followed a familiar path. In the US, a chaotic mix of university research and greedy corporate R&D somehow worked. An idea started in a lab, got bought by a company, and 5 years later, it was in your kitchen. Market incentives rewarded speed, usefulness, and improvement. Failure was costly, but it also created knowledge. Over time, this ecosystem accelerated itself. The Soviet system broke that chain. Think of it this way. Soviet scientists were among the pioneers of early computing and laser technology. They had the brains. But while an American engineer at Intel was incentivized to make a chip smaller and cheaper so it could be sold in millions of personal computers, a Soviet engineer was often told to keep things exactly as they were. Why? Because a new, more efficient chip would require the factory to stop production for 6 months to retool. CIA analysts were careful not to overstate their conclusions. The Soviet Union remained a formidable military power, capable of projecting force and sustaining hardship, but economically, the picture had stabilized into something far less threatening than once feared. Growth was slowing, structural reforms were failing, and the gap between potential and performance continued to widen. The question was no longer whether the Soviet system could match the United States economically, it was whether it could meaningfully reform itself at all. This reassessment had important consequences for American strategy. If the Soviet economy was not accelerating, then time itself became a strategic variable. Containment was no longer just about preventing expansion, it was about allowing systemic pressures to accumulate. Economic competition, technological leadership, and controlled engagement began to matter as much as deterrence. Inside intelligence circles, analysts increasingly emphasized long-term trends over short-term fluctuations. A good harvest or a spike in oil exports did not change the underlying trajectory. Temporary improvements masked deeper inefficiencies. Reports stressed that without fundamental changes to incentives and decision-making, the Soviet economy would continue to drift toward stagnation. What made this confidence unusual was its restraint. There was no desire to provoke instability or humiliation. Public triumphalism risked miscalculation. Privately, however, policymakers absorbed a powerful insight. Capitalism's advantage lay not in perfection, but in resilience. It could absorb shocks, correct mistakes, and reinvent itself. The Soviet system could not do so without undermining its own foundations. This realization influenced diplomatic posture as well. Economic exchanges, technological restrictions, and information flows were viewed through a new lens, not as concessions, but as stress tests. The more exposure the system faced, the more its weaknesses became apparent. By the time the decade ended, the Cold War looked different from inside the intelligence community than it did on the evening news. The fear of sudden Soviet economic dominance had faded. In its place stood a quieter belief that history, guided by data rather than ideology, was already moving. The numbers had not guaranteed an outcome, but they had narrowed the possibilities. And for the first time, American confidence rested not on hope or rhetoric, but on evidence. Superpowers aren't just built on tank divisions, they're built on the ability to fix mistakes before they bury you. Systems that reward honesty, flexibility, and innovation do not need to declare victory. Over time, reality does that for them. If you want more deep dives into the declassified history of the Cold War, hit like and subscribe. And if you want more deeply researched stories about the hidden forces that shaped our world, subscribe to History Unseen. You can fake the ideology, you can even fake the factory reports, but you can't fake the harvest.